Respected Dr. Suchitra Nadu Madam, Executive Director, Malma Medical College, our Principal, Dr. Vilasre Madam, Dr. Gupta Sir, faculty members, and dear students. On behalf of the Department of Clinical Research and Incubation Center, I welcome you all to this academic session on mucormycosis, an emerging challenge in COVID-19. A surge in the cases of mucormycosis has been observed in COVID-19 patients in the past few months. A multidisciplinary approach is essential for screening, diagnosis, and timely management of this life-threatening condition. We have with us today a team of faculty members representing the individual departments. How do these patients present clinically? What are the warning signs and symptoms? How can we identify these patients at the earliest and try to prevent or rather slow down the progression of this deadly condition? Our clinical experts, comprising of Dr. Santosh Kumar, Associate Professor, Department of ENT, Dr. Pragya Bhalerao, Assistant Professor, Dr. Vibhavari Barhate, SR, both from Department of Ophthalmology, and Dr. Harsh Desai, Maxillofacial Surgeon from Department of Dentistry, shall shed light on these questions.
Talking about the otolaryngological manifestations of mucor. So, I'll be giving insights into the clinical features of mucor, how to identify, how to screen. So, the first thing everybody is asking about, who is predisposed to developing this infection? Who are the class of patients who are going to get mucor? The first thing we all have to remember that timely diagnosis is critical to survival and minimization of morbidity. Okay, and you all know people are losing vision, people are dying because of mucor. So, timely diagnosis is critical to the survival of this patient. So, the most important risk factor for developing mucor is diabetes mellitus. It's said that 80% higher risk in people suffering from uncontrolled diabetes mellitus. At this stage, we have some hypothesis why this is happening in so many patients all of a sudden. And since it's very early in the epidemic, there are some theories. Again, these are all opinions, expert opinions, okay, and some papers. Excessive steam inhalation, an unusual habit of Indian people, too much steam inhalation promotes development of mucor. Microbiologists will tell you fungus love moist, hot environment, so that leads to development of mucor. There can be reduction in WBC partly because they have received steroids, partly because of infection. Reduced WBC count itself is a risk factor for development of mucor. And then you have to understand that this fungus is hungry for metals. It loves metals. All the pathogenesis of this fungus can be explained by just remembering that this fungus is hungry for metals. So the fungus can be promoted by taking zinc supplements, too much mask use. I mean, these are all theories. So most important people who were earlier before this epidemic were predisposed to developing mucor, which we used to see, is people with iron overload syndromes. These are people who had repeated hemodialysis. These are people who have hemochromatosis, people who have hemoglobinopathies, thalassemias, excessive iron. As I told you, the fungus is hungry for iron. It invades the blood vessels only because it's mining the human body of iron. So it goes through the blood vessels causing thrombosis of the optic artery leading to optic nerve death, blindness, thrombosis of the internal carotid artery leading to all sorts of neurological manifestations, thrombosis of the cavernous sinus, so on. And earlier organ transplantation patients with immunosuppression were at higher risk for developing mucor. Again, therapy of iron overload syndromes with iron chelating agents like desferoxamine was associated with higher risk of developing mucor, again because of iron. Now we are seeing an increased number of patients because of a triad of something is wrong. The rheumatologists are always giving steroids. We are always giving steroids to our allergic rhinitis patients. We have never seen mucor before. I have never seen a mucor. The thing is that something in COVID-19, mutant wave 2 COVID-19, as you remember previous wave there was no mucor, hardly any mucor. So now we are seeing more number of mucors because something has happened with this mutant COVID-19. Probably it is the first culprit. The second culprit which we frequently see is diabetic ketoacidosis. increased acid in the blood, acidic blood, again iron gets ionized and the mucor can start invading that blood vessel. Third is steroids because of reduced immunity. Normal serum inhibits the germination of mucor spores. Mucor cannot survive in normal human body. It can only colonize, it can never invade. If it is invading, something is wrong. So what are the signs and symptoms? The textbook signs and symptoms, the most common sign is facial swelling, redness of the face, as you can see here in the cheek region, fever, nasal congestion, rhinorrhea, bleeding from the nose, retroorbital swelling, headaches, facial pain, anesthesia of the nasal mucosa, facial soft tissue, diplopia, changes in visual acuity, mental status changes, and seizures. These are all the later stages. Initial stage, the patient has no signs and symptoms. And the most important signs and symptoms that we are observing, the experts are observing, is facial pain and frontal headache. This pain is very unusual in that it is present during the night time. There are so many people coming and asking, "Mere ko mucor hai kya? Mere ko mucor hai?" Most of them don't have mucor. They will tell vague pain here and there. This pain is not a vague pain. It's severe throbbing pain that is over the frontal region, and it persists during the night time. Again, this is an expert opinion of consensus among ENT surgeons that this pain is very severe and is seen during the night time. It is not allowing the patient to sleep. So whenever you have a diabetic patient who recovered from COVID-19, who comes and tells you that he has throbbing pain that is not allowing them to sleep, it is time to think about mucor. And then anesthesia of the cheeks in the distribution of the maxillary nerve is a textbook early sign for invasive fungal sinusitis. So there are 4 clinical stages. Again, this is by consensus. Okay, the first stage is the nasal stage, when the mucosal, when the spore germinates in the nasal mucosa. It's a spore. Its spore is present everywhere. It's present in our fridge, in our vegetable, in our furniture. It's present everywhere. You just have to switch off your fridge and close the door. You will find mucor growing on the fridge. The black thing that grows on the fridge is nothing but mucor. It's present everywhere. So the spore is present. It enters the nose. It finds a susceptible host on whose bodies it can germinate. Then it germinates. Once it germinates, patient has no symptoms. Then it starts invading the retroantral and premaxillary fat planes. Then also patient starts getting headaches. Then it starts entering into the orbit. Finally, it enters into the central nervous system and cavernous sinus, and finally leads to patient's death. The prognosis is worst in each successive stage. So how do you screen? This was requested that I speak a little bit about screening. How do you screen? The fungus initially invades the preorbital and periantral fat planes. So the only way to detect it at the earliest stage is to take a contrast enhanced magnetic resonance imaging scan, and you have to order specifically fat suppression sequences. Why do you order fat suppression sequence? Is that the fat always appears bright. So in order to, if you cut the fat out, you see the inflammation, you see the tissue invasion by mucor. So any area that shows up at bright signal in a susceptible patient in a T2 fat suppression sequence is probably mucor. And the most common site, like in this picture, is the retroantral space, the area behind the antrum, that is the pterygopalatine fossa. CT scan. Many people initially, the beginning, we were thinking, all ENTs were thinking, even textbook it is given, CT scans are the investigation of choice. CT scans are not investigation of choice. No more. Evidence is changed. Consensus is changed. CT scans are of limited use because the CT scan will only show a polyp, a mucosal thickening. This is a patient of actual mucormycosis, and you can see only mucosal thickening in the maxillary sinus. Okay, early stage there is only mucosal thickening. It cannot be differentiated from a common sinusitis on a CT scan. Okay, and in little bit more advanced stage, when the thrombosis has set in, when the bone and the mucosa start dying, that's when the CT scan become positive. By the time the patient is severely symptomatic, you can even make a diagnosis using a normal clinical signs. So this is again later stages. The diagnosis can be done with the diagnostic nasal endoscopy. When the destruction has set in, when the mucosa is thrombosed, when the mucosa is dying, you can make a diagnosis with the diagnostic nasal endoscopy. And the confirmation is only by tissue biopsy. Okay. The isolation of mucor from any part cannot be taken as evidence of invasion because mucor is a saprophyte. It grows everywhere. So if you isolate it from the nose, it never means that it is growing in the nose. It could just be a contaminant. So the only confirmatory test for mucor is biopsy. When you take a biopsy, the $1 million question asked to the ENT is to where to take a biopsy. The current recommendation is that in the early stages there are small ulcers in the mucosa. If you take biopsy from those sentinel ulcers, they are called sentinel ulcers, you can catch tissue invasion. Or you can take an MRI scan and see the areas which are bright on T2 fat suppression sequence, and you can take biopsy from those. So MRI helps a lot. So what does the diagnostic nasal endoscopy picture? This is for the benefit of the residents. You see the middle turbinate is involved in most of the patients. The middle turbinate undergoes avascular necrosis and it turns black, what is called the black turbinate sign. And there are small ulcers, what we call sentinel scars, small ulcers in the mucosa. These are areas where the fungus is invading into the mucosa, and biopsy from those areas will yield the tissue invasion and prove the tissue invasion of the fungus. Again, in the later stages, when the thrombosis has set in and the mucosa is dead and the bone is dead, you get necrotic tissue and absence of bleeding from the affected site. You get black and white discoloration of the mucosa. You get sloughing, crusting, and necrosis and hypovascular areas. The turbinate starts looking black, like in this picture. So, what is the role of surgeon? It is to debulk the dead tissue so that it reduces the fungal load and improve the penetration of the antifungal agent. So, the dead tissue is gone and the inflamed areas, the antifungal can penetrate and stop the spread of fungus. Of course, to provide biopsy for the confirmation of the fungus and to debride all the devitalized tissue until clear bleeding margins are seen. So, what we do is basically ethmoidectomy along with the debridement of retroorbital space and enucleation of the sinus or sinoorbital disease. Now, a little bit about the antifungal therapy, because nobody is going to talk about it. I am going to talk about a little bit about the antifungal therapy. There are only two antifungals on which consensus is there in Mucor. One is amphotericin B, the second is posaconazole. Amphotericin B is the gold standard. For the benefit of the interns who are here, amphotericin B does not work in Cunningham-Ala species. If Cunningham-Ala is isolated, amphotericin B does not work for it. Okay. And how does amphotericin B work? It binds to ergosterol and it breaks down the cell membrane and thereby kills the fungus. The big problem of antifungal therapy is the fungus is very similar evolutionary to human cell. So the organelles, all the fungal organelles are present in human cell also. So you cannot develop an antibiotic without it being toxic to us. That is why amphotericin B and posaconazole are also very toxic. Okay, essentially because of similarity, they are all eukaryotic, unlike bacteria which is prokaryotic. So amphotericin B is effective against all these organisms except your Cunningham-Ala. Dose is around 1 milligram per kg per day for 4 to 8 weeks, or as long as the patient is harboring the fungus. So amphotericin B per se is very toxic. So they have endosomal lipid formulations of amphotericin B which are available, which is called liposomal amphotericin B lipid complex, amphotericin B colloidal dispersion, of which 1 and 2 are only used. The third one is too toxic to be of any clinical use. And the most important toxicity which all of us have to remember is nephrotoxicity. It is extremely toxic to the kidney, with 80% patients experiencing some form of nephrotoxicity. It is toxic to the kidneys and reduces the glomerular filtration, later leading to increased blood urea nitrogen. So we must watch for both serum creatinine and blood urea nitrogen when we are giving amphotericin B. So how do you prevent nephrotoxicity? A little bit about it. You have to administer intravenous normal saline 1 liter before and after giving amphotericin B. This is the consensus. What happens is that if you give normal saline, the renal perfusion is maintained and nephrotoxicity is very much reduced. So you have to give saline before and after. And important news for the interns, the house surgeons, when you give amphotericin B, the patient will develop thrombophlebitis. You must give it in wide bore needle. You must not give it in narrow needle, and you must ensure that the needle is in the vein. It is extremely toxic. Patient will develop thrombophlebitis. 15 minutes? Okay, one more slide please. And you have to make sure that the venous access is perfect before giving amphotericin B. And other toxicities are hypotension, fever, and for the benefit of the interns, you have to pre-medicate with dexamethasone and NSAIDs before giving amphotericin B. Another problem of amphotericin B is patient can develop arrhythmias, so you have to watch for cardiac toxicity. You have to also watch for decrease in sodium and potassium levels, so you have to monitor those and you have to give that. And in turn, acidosis, amphotericin B itself lead to tubular acidosis, and long-term amphotericin B is linked with normocytic normochromic anemia. So you have to watch all this while giving amphotericin B. It's very toxic. Posaconazole is a salvage therapy for instead if patients who have renal failure, who cannot tolerate amphotericin B toxicity, have to be treated with only posaconazole. This is the only antifungal that is effective against Mucor currently. It also works by inhibiting ergosterol synthesis. The good thing about posaconazole is that oral preparation is available. Patient can take the tablet or the syrup at home. Okay, oral preparation is available. You need not admit the patient and give. Patient can take the medicine at home also. So oral preparation is available. And there are some experimental therapies. This is the last slide. Experimental therapies like hyperbaric oxygen. The sinus mucosa is predominantly not rich in oxygen. That is why the fungus is able to multiply inside the sinus. So giving hyperbaric oxygen is a research avenue for prevention and treatment of mucormycosis. You can give GM-CSF, granulocyte, colony stimulating factor, granulocyte, macrophage, colony stimulating factors. And of course, you can starve the fungus by chelating iron out. This is a new molecule, desferasirox, which is available. We can chelate the iron out and starve the fungus of the iron, thereby treating mucormycosis. Finally, early magnetic resonance imaging with gadolinium enhanced contrast and T2 fat suppression sequence. Aggressive treatment to rapidly restore euglycemia and normal acid-base status is critical to diabetics. Debridement of necrotic tissue is also important. Amphotericin B is the gold standard drug. When amphotericin B cannot be used, posaconazole or desferasirox are the only reliable options in treatment of mucormycosis. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'll be talking on rhinocerebral mucormycosis. So rhinocerebral mucormycosis with mucor infection of fungus is a traded condition which has got a mortality rate of 50% even with the treatment. Basically, it is an opportunistic infection in which there is invasion of blood vessels by fungal hyphae leading to necrosis and infarction of the host tissue. Now we all know that it enters through the nose, but how does it reaches to the orbit? So first route is nasolacrimal duct. Once it enters through the nose, it reaches the medial turbinate and it colonizes over the medial turbinate. From medial turbinate, it reaches to the inferior turbinate, and at inferior turbinate there is an opening of nasolacrimal duct. Once it enters into the nasolacrimal duct, it reaches to the orbital cavity. Now second route is lamina papracia. Lamina papracia is paper thin bony part of medial wall of the orbit, and when there is an infection in the ethmoid sinus here, when there is an infection in the ethmoid sinus, it will reach to the medial part of the orbit to this lamina papracia. Now, what are the red flag signs or warning symptoms that you should be aware of to rule out orbital mucormycosis? So, first of all, there is sudden loss of vision that may be because of central retinal artery occlusion or ophthalmic artery occlusion, or that may be because of optic neuritis. Then second is patient may complain of retroorbital pain, and that may extend to the upper part of cheek, or even patient may complain of headache. Then patient may present to you with lid and periocular edema. You can see in this picture there is upper lid and lower lid edema in the right eye, and there is loss of lid crease because of edema. There can be conjunctival congestion and chemosis because of passive edema. Patient may present to you with proptosis. Now proptosis can be there because of two reasons. First, there is a lesion lying at the apex itself and pushing the eyeball forward. And second reason is proptosis may be because of passive edema because of inflammation due to necrosis due to COVID infection. Patient may present to you with ptosis, diplopia and ophthalmoplegia. Now once the mucor infection reaches to the orbital apex, you can see here this is superior orbital fissure, this is inferior orbital fissure, and this is optic canal. So once it reaches the orbital apex, it invades the cranial nerves passing through these fissures and the canal, and it will lead to restriction of movement of extraocular muscle because of paralysis of extraocular muscle. In this picture you can see in primary position patient there is ptosis in the left eye, and in left eye there is restriction of movement on lateral gaze. So patient may complain of diplopia also because of restriction of movement. There can be infraorbital anesthesia because of involvement of infraorbital nerve, because of involvement of floor of the orbit by mucormycosis. There can be paresthesia or anesthesia over the maxillary sinus because of involvement of trigeminal nerve. You may see facial discoloration that may change from pallor, erythema, bluish and blackish discoloration of face because of necrotic tissue. Now, what do we do when patient comes to us in OPD? So, apart from history of predisposing factors, as sir has told, we check his visual acuity to rule out whether there is diminution of vision or total loss of vision. Then we check his ocular motility. Now, ocular motility is checked in all 9 positions of gaze, and that can be graded from 0 to -4 according to the involvement of the restriction of muscle. 0 is normal and -4 is total restriction of movement of that muscle. Once we check the ocular motility, we check his pupillary reaction, and if there is sluggishly reacting pupil or relative afferent pupillary defect, then there may be involvement of optic nerve because of involvement of the orbital apex. We check tenderness and paresthesia over the maxillary area, frontal area and ethmoidal area. Then if there is a proptosis, we measure the proptosis in both eyes. We check his corneal sensations. If they are reduced, that means his trigeminal nerve is involved. Then we check his color vision to rule out any involvement of optic nerve. If color vision is defective, that indicates there is some problem with the optic nerve. Then we do dilated fundus examination. We may find central retinal artery occlusion. Then choroidal folds can be seen. There can be disc edema, or there can be central retinal vein occlusion with dilated tortuous blood vessels. Now, once we suspect clinically the presence of orbital mucormycosis, we subjected patient for further investigations like deep nasal swab subjected to KOH mount or calcifier white mount. Various serological tests and PCR can be done to confirm the diagnosis. Contrast MRI is most important investigation to rule out orbital infection in mucormycosis. So, what do we see on MRI? There can be perineuritis, or in muscle because of inflammation there is enlargement of muscle. There can be involvement of retroorbital fat. We always correlate MRI findings with CT scans to rule out any involvement of orbital wall due to mucormycosis. You can see here in first picture, there is involvement of maxillary sinus along with involvement of medial orbit. In second picture, there is involvement of orbital apex, and here you can see there is involvement of retroorbital fat. This was the patient who had admitted to our hospital. He presented to us with restriction of movement. There is restriction of movement in his right eye on lateral gaze. So on MRI, we can see there is involvement of the orbital apex, and there is involvement of retrobulbar fat, and there is thickening of optic nerve in right eye comparative to left eye. So, explanation of early warning signs to the patients on discharge. High index of suspicion, early diagnosis will lead to early treatment, and this will definitely this will definitely give better prognosis of life and vision to the patient. Thank you. Dr. Pragna will discuss various treatment modalities for orbital mucormycosis.
Good afternoon, everyone. I will be dealing with the treatment part of orbital mucormycosis. It mainly consists of 4 parts: systemic antifungal, conservative debridement with irrigation of amphotericin B, transcutaneous retrobulbar and liposomal amphotericin B, and orbital excentration, out of which systemic antifungal and conservative debridement has been covered by Dr. Santosh sir. So I will be mainly dealing with transcutaneous retrobulbar amphotericin B and orbital excentration. So transcutaneous retrobulbar amphotericin B can be given in conjunction with a functional endoscopic sinus surgery and systemic antifungal therapy. It is a minimally invasive procedure and can be performed bedside. Multiple sessions can be given. Now, what are the indications of retrobulbar amphotericin B? It can be given in early orbital involvement if there is a progressive orbital involvement despite of systemic antifungal therapy, and in advanced orbital disease as a conservative option and an option before accentration. Now, what is the site of amphotericin B injection? It depends upon the site of the lesion. Most commonly, the medial orbit is involved, hence medial intraconal block can be given through the medial caruncle. If the inferomedial orbit is involved, then the injection can be given at the junction of medial 1/3 and lateral 2/3 in the inferior orbital margin. If the inferolateral orbit is involved, then the injection can be given at the junction of medial 2/3 and lateral 1/3. If the apex of the orbit is involved, then the injection can be given in a retrobulbar space. In advanced cases, retrobulbar as well as peribulbar injections can be given. Now, this is a slide which shows that the retrobulbar amphotericin B can be given with the help of cannula. It is an 18 gauge cannula. This slide I have taken from Dr. Murthy. He is an oculoplastic surgeon. He has tried retrobulbar amphotericin B with the help of cannula. So the patient has improved. The lid edema and all the ocular features has improved. Now there is one video which will show how to administer retrobulbar amphotericin B.
Hello everyone, this video demonstrates the intraorbital amphotericin injection for orbital mucormycosis. Here is a patient who is a 65-year-old male who has a visual potential in the right eye and sinus debridement has already been done. If you look at his scans, you can see that the inferomedial part of the orbit is involved, and that is what would receive the amphotericin injection. So we take the amphotericin deoxycholate 50 mg lyophilized powder vial. First you aspirate sterile water for injection. Since the vial is only 10 cc, you can only aspirate 10 cc of sterile injection. So initially add the 10 cc into the vial, then you aspirate the entire amphotericin 10 cc. To that add 4 more cc's of sterile water. This gives you 50 milligrams in 14 ml, which makes it 3.5 milligrams per ml. You can now place it back into the vial, which is ready for future injections, and you can store it with a date. So 1 cc of Ampho, 3.5 milligrams, and then we also take 1 cc of Xylocaine. So these two are what you need for your injection procedure. The process can be done at the bedside with sterile aseptic precautions. We are going transcutaneous into the inferomedial orbit. First time injecting the Xylocaine, and then you inject the amphotericin in the same manner. Thank you very much.
So the diluted solution of amphotericin B can be stored at 4 degrees Celsius, and the vial should be covered to protect from sunlight. The diluted solution can be used up to 4 weeks. 24 or 26 gauge needle can be used, and the length of the needle depends upon the depth of involvement. Up to 5 injections can be given on daily or on alternate day basis. We have to monitor for vision, clinical finding, and radiological evaluation on weekly basis. So what happens after retrobulbar injection of amphotericin B? There will be orbital inflammatory reaction, increased conjunctival chemosis, increased orbital pressure. There may be development of orbital compartment syndrome, which requires lateral canthotomy and cantholysis. If the functional endoscopic sinus surgery has been done with a medial wall resection, then there is a less chance of development of orbital compartment syndrome. This is all about retrobulbar amphotericin B. Now, exentration. So what are the indications of exentration? Exentration can be done when there is extensive orbital involvement with or without CNS involvement. If the ocular features are worsening despite of retrobulbar injections after 72 hours. This is one scoring system depending upon the clinical features, fundus finding and radiological evaluation, which will score total up to 45. Based on this scoring system, it is observed that those patients who cross the score of 23 are eligible candidate for exentration. And exentration can be done in non-seeing eye, and if there is a perforation of the eyeball by the fungus, then also exentration can be done. Now, if there is a involvement of lead in mucormycosis, then we have to do total exentration. The second slide shows the picture of total exentration, and if the leads are not involved, then we can do lead sparing exentration. Now in exentration, we have to remove all the intraorbital content along with its periosteum in toto. So this is the post-op photograph of a patient after total exentration. And this is a photograph of a patient after lead sparing exentration. So lead sparing exentration has a cosmetic benefit. So to sum up, high degree of clinical suspicion, clinico-radiologic diagnosis, early debridement with antifungal treatment, retrobulbar amphotericin B and exentration will all save the life of the patient and vision of the patient. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. At the outset, I would like to thank respected ED Madam, our Principal Madam, and the organizing team for giving me the opportunity to give few insights on the maxillofacial perspective in mucormycosis. So, the main reason why we as a specialty can be involved in treating or detecting mucormycosis cases are because most of the patients which we have seen, they report to us with dental pain or facial pain and mobility of teeth. So if you can see the red flags, we have mobile teeth without any local cause. Secondly, we have dental pain or facial pain accompanied with facial pain, again without any local obvious cause. Palatal ulceration is known to happen in many other diseases, but characteristically in mucormycosis, we see that as the first sign in the oral cavity. Secondly, we have intraoral draining sinuses. I will be showing you all the clinical pictures, but intraoral draining sinuses commonly are concerned with caries or badly decayed teeth. But in patients with mucormycosis, we may not necessarily see caries or badly destructed teeth. As ENT people also discussed, there is facial erythema, discoloration of the facial skin, periorbital erythema, edema, and fever. So if we are able to catch the clinical signs in a very early period, plus if we do the correct necessary investigations, we will be able to diagnose mucormycosis and pick it up fast so that we can treat the patient and reduce the mortality rate. So if you can see in this picture, you can see palatal ulceration, which is seen as the first sign in mucormycosis. Then we see multiple draining sinuses. We see multiple draining sinuses in the maxillary alveolar region, and if you see in the middle picture, there is no obvious cause for the sinuses to appear. This is a very advanced stage where the maxilla is completely denuded of the mucosa. Also, there are few cases reported where mucormycosis had affected the mandible. But mandible being a compact bone, mucormycosis is less likely to occur in the mandible as compared to the maxilla. And we also see upper lip swelling along with some nasal discharge. As we all know, MRI and CT-PNS are currently considered the gold standard for diagnosing and knowing the extent of the disease. But as far as our specialty is concerned, we are able to see multiple bony erosions or osteolytic lesions in the maxilla and mandible. So if you can see on this 3D reconstruction of the CT, we see multiple osteolytic lesions here. Even here in the anterior maxilla, we see loss of alveolar crestal bone. Even in the OPG, you are able to see some irregular bone loss here, which is suggestive of osteolysis. So is there an actual role of prevention strategy when it comes to the dental fraternity. So far, whatever has been discussed and arrived at through a common consensus is by giving oral rinses of povidone iodine and chlorhexidine. The other steps which can be used are nasal irrigation, strict glycemic control, and for whichever patients who are admitted in ICU for a long period of time, who received steroids, who received oxygenation, they should be screened prior to their discharge, or alternatively they can be called up for the follow-up visits and their oral screening can be done. Because of mobility of teeth being one of the common clinical signs in mucormycosis, most of the dentists who do not have any prior information or knowledge about this disease, they straight away go into extracting those teeth. So that becomes one factor which can lead to the mucormycosis spreading very rapidly and involving the entire maxilla. So extraction of mobile teeth has to be deferred. We should not give analgesics, antibiotics for routine facial pain, because that has been the common practice. If there is any tooth which is slightly carious, and that could be considered as the cause of the facial pain, and patient is commonly given antibiotics, analgesics. So that wastes the valuable time which the patient has. If there is any suspected case, immediate oral surgeon's opinion or ENT opinion has to be sought. If there are draining sinuses intraorally, we can take the swabs of the pus and send for KOH or culture. If there is any palatal lesion or even in the mandible, you can easily debride that lesion and send for KOH or histopathology and culture. According to ICMR guidelines, there is no role of prophylactic antifungals in the current scenario. Surgical debridement remains the mainstay of treating mucormycosis along with the medicinal therapy. And surgical debridement is said that it should be done as aggressively as possible. So, as maxillofacial surgeon or as a dental fraternity, we have dual roles. First is treating the mucormycosis surgically, and later is dental rehabilitation. So this is a flow chart of the indications of the surgery depending upon the extent of the mucormycosis. So if the maxilla is completely involved, then we have to resort to maxillectomy. If there is maxilla and minimal zygoma involvement, then maxillectomy, there is a subtotal maxillectomy which can be done. If there is maxilla zygoma up to the orbit, then it is a complex procedure which involves maxillectomy with orbital exenteration. So these are few pictures of the surgery of mucormycosis. You can see this is the entire maxilla which has been removed, or maxillectomy has been done, and it is not always possible to suture the wounds together. And second advantage of keeping the wounds open is it facilitates drainage, or second, you can administer some topical antifungal agents also. If you see on the in the intra picture, you can see that the maxilla is completely chalky white and there is no bleeding at all, because there is avascular necrosis of the maxilla. Even when you raise the flap, there is no bleeding. Final reconstruction or the secondary reconstruction has to be delayed until the disease is completely eradicated. And even final obturator prosthesis, which I will be showing you all, has to be deferred until you achieve local control of the disease. So the options for secondary reconstruction would be bony and soft tissue. In maxilla, it may not be always possible to do a bone grafting. So some surgeons resort to soft tissue reconstruction and close the excised area. But when we come to bony reconstruction, if you can see, this part of the left side of the mandible is missing. The resection has been done. So this is known as transport distraction osteogenesis, where we can take some part of the native bone, put a transport disc, and we can grow this entire mandible. This is costochondral grafting, which is commonly preferred in maxillofacial surgery in children, because it has a role of growing along with the child. Third is iliac crest corticocancellous grafting. In this resection defect, corticocancellous graft of iliac crest has been done. And the most favored one, whenever there is a mandibular resection or a maxillectomy done, is free fibula flap. Later, in those patients who are not fit for surgery, or those patients where the defect is beyond bone grafting or repair, we often resort to prosthetic rehabilitation. And in this prosthetic phase, maxillofacial prosthodontist, which is a specialty of dentistry, has an important role. So commonly, if we are planning a maxillectomy for a mucormycosis patient, in the pre-op stage, we can make an impression of the upper and lower arches and fabricate a surgical obturator. So after the maxillectomy is done, intraoperatively, we can fix this surgical obturator in the patient's mouth. So that helps in covering the palate primarily, and it seals the oral cavity from the nasal cavity. So if you see, there are no teeth embedded in this, it is just a form of some seal. These are the types of maxillectomy defects which have been classified by Aramani. Second obturator is interim obturator. So say after a few weeks or 7 to 10 days of the surgery, patient can be given an interim obturator which may or may not contain teeth, because as the tissue heals, this previous feeding plate may not fit. And once the disease is completely eradicated and the healing is completed, we go for a definitive obturator, which is 3 to 6 months after the surgery. So if you can see here, this is how the obturator looks like. So in this maxillectomy defect, after the healing has been completed, this is the obturator which is fabricated. So this has complete set of teeth, and this is the extension which goes into the maxillectomy defect. Second, when there is mandibular resection which has been done, we give something known as a guide flange. So because of the constant muscle pull, there is high chance that the mandible shifts to the normal side, to the operated side. So to prevent that shifting, we give a guide flange temporarily until the patient receives, say, a secondary reconstruction. And ultimately, after the secondary healing, or after the healing of the patient is complete and patient is free of disease, we can rehabilitate the maxillectomy by doing zygomatic implants, or in case of mandible, we can even use intraosseous implants. And HBOT has been reported in previous papers to be an adjunctive measure, okay, for treating mucormycosis. So we all know HBOT is commonly used in chronic wounds or in chronic osteomyelitis, or when there were compromised grafts and flaps. Okay, so currently in mucormycosis, the rationale is that HBOT increases the oxygen saturation in these patients. Secondly, oxygen is considered to be toxic to the microbes at such high concentration and at 2 to 3 atmospheric pressure. It also facilitates healing, improves vascularity, and stimulates new blood vessel growth or neoangiogenesis. So the triad of mucormycosis is completely reversed if you start giving HBOT along with your medicinal management, and it has been reported to actually complement the action of amphotericin B. But currently the research of HBOT, use of HBOT in mucormycosis, is still in its infancy stage. So more research has to be done on the efficacy of HBOT as an adjunctive measure in mucormycosis. Thank you.
Thank you, speakers. We have come to the end of the session 1, that was on clinical aspects. We can take a few questions just related to the clinical aspects. Any comments?
One thing I just wanted to tell, that all the speakers have said early diagnosis is very important. Early diagnosis of each stage is very important. Suppose when stage 3 has said, stage 3 is orbital. So what will be the earliest? And cross reference is also very important. That means if an ENT surgeon is dealing, he must know what are the earliest signs or symptoms of stage 3. Earliest will be involvement of the recti muscle. There will be restriction of the movements, and if he has done MRI, then on MRI there will be medial rectus is the first to be removed. Similarly, much more important is stage 4, earliest, which an ophthalmologist must know. And what will be that? that will be contralateral periorbital edema. I am saying contralateral, other side. I am not talking of this side. If contralateral periorbital edema has occurred, and if contralateral retractus is involved, that indicates the cavernous sinus is involved. Before that, rather, is you must do fundus examination contralateral. Other fundus examination, if you see dilated veins and congested disc, that indicates that cavernous sinus has come, and this is a stage 4. So I am emphasizing is early diagnosis and cross-reference, and early treatment is very important. So you must know earliest of each stage. Just other thing, hyperbaric oxygen, you have talked of, but you should know that there are only hyperbaric oxygen, 3 chambers are available in India. One is in Leh, High Altitude Medical Research Center, which came first in the country, which I have worked in high altitude regarding this retinal hypoxia cases. Other chamber which is available is in INHS Ashwini Bombay with the Navy. And there is one other third chamber is there. So if it is approachable, then you can use this hyperbaric oxygen therapy. Other thing which I wanted to tell is, Dr. Santosh is talking about this desferoxamine is a chelating agent. And your COVID is also causing iron over, and suppose there is a case of thalassemia, beta minor, and now this case has well COVID. So the iron levels may go very high. At that time, you should give desferoxamine and this chelating agent so that it can prevent this mucormycosis. As you know, he has emphasized that iron and zinc, they are the in which fungus flourish. So we must see what is the serum ferritin level, and if serum ferritin levels are going high, we must give chelating agent antidote. And the patient must be taking lot of zinc before that. At that stage, you must stop zinc. Once the patient has developed already COVID, you must stop it. Before, it is only for prevention. But once the patient has developed, then please don't give zinc, and the iron level, if it is high, you must give antidote. So it is for prevention.
From the point of view of rehabilitation, just a humble request from all the clinicians, in case, even if it is exenteration or any sort of maxillofacial rehabilitation is planned in the future, a pre-operative referral to the maxillofacial prosthodontist is essential, because even we saw in the case of the exenteration, we can give an orbitile conformer which will prevent shrinkage of the orbit, and it also gives us a chance to make an impression of the orbit and the rehabilitation.
So now we move on to the next session. The next session is about diagnostics. Once we clinically suspect or diagnose mucormycosis in a patient, we need to act promptly. A diagnostic team comprising of Dr. Santosh Sabnis, Professor Radiodiagnosis, Dr. Sadhna Chate, Professor Department of Microbiology, and Dr. Zope, Associate Professor, Department of Pathology, will elaborate on, are imaging studies helpful? When do we need to do them? What is the earliest and simple investigation that can be done? What is the role of the pathologist? Does histopathology really help identifying certain valuable indicators?
Good afternoon. Thanks a lot for inviting me here today. I think most of the speakers have talked about MRI, so my role is quite easy, and everybody seems to know what happens in MRI, so it's quite easy for me. So I'll just go fast in this. So recently, IRI, our parent body, with our college, has given guidelines and recommendations for the imaging that is to be done in acute invasive fungal rhinosinusitis and mucormycosis. So I'll be sticking to these guidelines and elaborate on further. But what is the role of imaging? As all of us know, early diagnosis, as everybody has discussed, very important, because the disease is rapidly progressive and we want to prevent it or stop it at the earliest. The findings should be discussed with the clinician. It's a team effort, and the clinicians and the imaging specialist should sit together and talk about it. The extent of the disease should be assessed properly, And obviously for planning of surgery it is important which areas are involved and what all can be done. And afterwards also again for follow-up purposes, radiology is important. Imaging modalities, plain X-rays and not much use. You will not see anything other than haziness unless there is a bony destruction or so. So computed tomography or CT scan is the mainstay of imaging modality. It was initially thought to be the gold standard, but with MRI, now CT has taken a back seat. The advantage of CT is very commonly available, it's quick and it's cost effective. It is often sufficient if you are making just an initial diagnosis, but for further management MRI is needed. It is the modality of choice, of course, because of its superior soft tissue contrast resolution. We can see intracranial structures better. Smaller, earlier cerebritis and edemas can be picked up by MRI. A vascular assessment is obviously better with MRI. I'll not bore you with the CT technique. Sufficient to say that we start from the area to be covered is right from superiorly to the top of the frontal sinuses, right to the with including the jaws. Anteriorly go right up to the ala of the nose, and posteriorly go up to the retrobulbar stage or pre-sinus areas. Axial sections can be done and reconstructions can be made in whichever plane you want, and brain is to be included if you are suspecting intracranial involvement. MRI is definitely better. It is done in supine position. T1 basic image is taken, and then depending on that you can take various fat suppressed images, T1, T2 stir images and so on and so forth. Diffusion method imaging is also done. We take 3 or 4 millimeter thick slices and up right from the frontal sinus to the jaw. There is a staging which is clinical, semi-radiological, in which there is diseases sinonasal, orbital, intracranial. It is good if you are thinking in terms of progression or in easy communication to the patient, but this is not rigidly so, because that one part of the system can be involved in without the other being involved. So you may have orbital lesion without any sinonasal lesion and so on. So what are the common CT findings? When you come to the nasal cavity and sinuses, it is usually a unilateral pathology, sometimes may be seen bilaterally. The middle terminant is the commonly affected areas and the surrounding sinuses. Frontal is relatively lesser affected as compared with the sphenoid and as compared to the ethmoid and maxillary. Early signs are the ulcerations, small ulcerations as clinically been shown, and they are seen mainly in the nasal septum. Along with that there is emphysema. There is inflammatory mucosal thickening, fluid may be there in the sinus and our surrounding places. So basically it's just a sinusitis picture. You will see it in any sinusitis, and now that we have a high suspicion of mucor, any sinus in the current situation should raise a high index of mucormycosis. The disease can extend obviously outside the sinus. There be bone destruction, which is common, but in absence of bone destruction also you will see there is extent of the disease. So there is periantral planes are lost, fat stranding is seen, soft tissues is seen in the surrounding spaces, the pterygoaxillary fissure, pterygoparotid fossa, etc. And there is bony erosion, bony dehiscence, orbital invasions, CT and intracranial extensions are the late sequelae of this. So as you can see in this, there is mucosal thickening and periantral fat stranding. There is no obvious destruction of the bone as such, but still the disease has progressed further. And in the lower section there is a coronal view, and in which you can see the ulcerations and edema. So this is the right maxillary sinusitis with destruction of the maxillary floor, and there is some focal erosion of the sphenoid roof as well. So extensive maxillary sinusitis with bony dehiscence is seen. Same erosion of the maxillary sinus, involvement of the hard palate. As we saw all these things clinically, they are seen beautifully radiologically. When there is an orbital extension, as Sir said, there is preseptal and eyelid thickening and edema. The extraocular muscles are also involved. There is fat stranding, the stranding at extraconal as well as intraconal orbital fat, with or without enhancement. If the tissue is alive, you will see enhancement. If it is dead, you will not see any enhancement. there will be phlegmon or inflammatory mass, abscess formation may or may not happen. The orbital nerve will involve and may get involved, and orbital apex disease may also take place. So in this, there is nodular thickening and stranding in the right orbital flat. It shows both extraconal as well as intraconal involvement. This is a classic picture, and because of the extensive disease, the shape of the globe changes because of the presence of proptosis and increase in the fat density, etc. The shape of the orbit becomes like that of a guitar pick. So you see the orbital globe has turned. So it's a classic sign, guitar pick sign. If there's an intracranial extension, you will see signs of all these pathologies, mainly cavernous sinus thrombosis, involvement of the carotid artery which is lying close by. The carotid may get thrombosed, may get narrowed, or may get dissect. You may get pseudoaneurysm formation. You may get mycotic aneurysms. There will be leptomeningeal enhancement, but these are seen better on MRI. And other manifestations like granulomas and abscess formations there. So CT is a wonderful modality, but it has some limitations. This is because CT is inherently limited in assessing the intracranial pathologies. For example, cerebral, cortical, meningeal, etc. are not seen so well as compared with MRI. Bone infiltration changes on CT happen at a later date. We will not be able to pick up marrow edema on CT scan, which is seen very nicely on an MRI. And the enhancement pattern is not so good on CT as compared with the MRI. So this brings us to the MRI findings. In nasal cavity and sinuses, apart from the classical CT findings that will definitely be seen on MRI, we will see soft tissue infiltration in periantral flat planes, especially the premaxillary and retromaxillary flat planes. These are seen based on fat suppressed sequences, as Dr. Santosh has already told us. Intermediate to hypointense on T2 images, or sometimes hyperintense may also be seen. And the lack of contrast enhancement is highly suggestive of tissue necrosis, and this gives us to the classical sign, black turbinate sign. We'll see. So this is a black turbinate sign, and there is no enhancement on contrast. So the rest of the turbinates are enhancing quite nicely, but here there is no enhancement, indicating that there is necrosis of the tissue. Then this is bone infiltration, the CT and the MRI picture. See the superiority of MRI over CT. There is MRI which is showing complete replacement of the marrow fat at the left maxillary alveolar margin, which is seen very beautifully. On the right side you can see there. And so bone edema is picked up very early, bone destruction is picked up very early on this thing. So if you get post-contrast non-enhancing multiple areas, that indicate that the tissue there is dead, and this will necessitate extensive debridement. Then in orbital extension, the MR findings will be, apart from again the typical CT findings, we'll see optic nerve involvement in a better way. In diffusion weighted images, there will be restriction because of the nerve infarction, and blindness can result in these patients. Orbital apex disease is picked up better, and thickening of extraocular muscles, fat infiltration, and edema. Again, they will be seen very nicely, and the classical guitar pick sign will be seen on MRI better than on CT. So again, you can see the guitar pick sign, the proptosis, the edema has given rise to this sign. There is involvement of the muscles, and apart from that, you can see some area of cerebritis, and there is involvement of the brain parenchyma as well. You can see the sinusitis along with in the ethmoidal as well as sphenoid sinuses. In intracranial extension, the findings again will be, apart from the CT findings typical that we discussed, early cerebritis will be picked up very well, and high signal, which will be seen as high signal on FLAIR images, and enhancement will be seen on gadolinium. Intracerebral granulomas will be seen. White matter edema, which will not be seen on CT, will be picked up on MRI. Abscess formation is seen, and perineural spread and cranial nerve infiltration, especially the trigeminal nerve and its branches, which is most commonly affected, will be seen better with MRI. So this is a case in which there is a occlusion of the right internal carotid artery. On T1 weighted images, there is no flow is noted in the carotid artery, and you can see an extensive area of infarction in the region of the ICA. Again, there is stenosis of the artery and a formation of a pseudoaneurysm in the pulp. This is an intracerebral fungal abscess. You can see here the frontal sinus showing disease, and later on you can see in the B image there is a signal of there is a high intensity signal in the region, which is again seen on this section. And then diffusion weighted images, you can see peripheral diffusion restriction, and on contrast the abscess is enhancing quite nicely. Again, same picture, diffusion weighted, there is a peripheral diffusion restriction, and on contrast there is enhancement. Cavernous sinus thrombosis is a dreaded complication. There is trigeminal nerve invasion in such cases, and you can see here the bulging margins of the cavernous sinus compared with the normal size. I'll just take 2 more minutes. Apart from that, coexistent pulmonary fungal involvement should also be kept in mind, and it will be the findings of CT scan are quite non-specific. You may get ground glass opacity as seen in the routine COVID patients, and there will be nodules, consolidation, multiple lesions, etc. So what are the recommendations? The recommendations are every suspected case of rhinoorbital cerebral fungal disease should ideally have an MRI of sinuses, orbits and brain with contrast. CT is good, cost effective, fast, and can provide most of the information needed when the disease is confined to the extracranial sites. It should be reported and interpreted by experienced qualified radiologist. Communication and discussion with clinical team is essential, as this is a dreaded disease with complications, disfiguring surgeries and rapid progression. Thank you for your patient care.
Good afternoon. I will be covering the microbiological diagnostic part of mucormycosis. But before that, which are the fungi which are responsible for mucormycosis? So mucormycosis is a life-threatening infection caused by several species of filamentous fungi belonging to the order Mucorales. They are extremely rare in healthy individuals. This is very, very important sentence. They are extremely rare in healthy individuals, but several immunocompromised conditions. As it is a life-threatening infection and fatal infection, timely diagnosis is very important. So it is a crucial part of the treatment for the survival of the patient and to reduce need and extent of surgical resection, disfigurement and sufferings. So this is the classification of the different mucorales. So whenever we hear the word mucor, so we have in our mind the genus Mucor. But in the mucormycosis it is not like that. So in the mucormycosis, all the mucorales, order mucorales, it contains 15 species of the fungi. So mucorales actually they are the molds, they are filamentous fungi and they are found everywhere in the environment. So we are getting exposed to that fungal spores constantly. But as the people they are having good immunity, they are not having the disease. So which are the common mucorales which are isolated from the mucormycosis patients? So these are the Rhizopus, which is very commonly isolated fungus during this mucormycosis from these mucormycosis patients. Then second is the Mucor. Third one, Rhizomucor combination may be there. Then Leishmania, Apophysomyces and Cunninghamella species. So in that the Upsidia, the last one, the Cunninghamella, the Upsidia is again common. So these are the common mucorales which we can find in mucormycosis patients. So all these mucorales, they are fast growing fungi. They grow within 3 to 7 days. They are highly developed mycelium and have branch hyphae. Their hyphae, they are aseptate, but later on they may mature and hyphae they become the septate hyphae. And multispore sporangia they are present. Spores they are present in the sporangium, and these spores they are responsible for the infection. These spores they thrive in dry and humid condition and they are transmitted through the air. So what is the mode of transmission? Inhalation of the spores even ingestion of the spores, inoculation of the spores in the open wounds can cause mucormycosis. So up till now you have seen rhino-orbital cerebral mucormycosis, and sir also mentioned about the involvement of the lung. So when there occurs the involvement of the lung when the patient is neutropenic, bone marrow or organ transplant patients, then some patients having hematological malignancies, then some patients with the some patients having malnourishment, they have involvement of the intestinal tract. Then there may be involvement of the skin, also jaw bones, and in invasive type of mucormycosis, there may be involvement of even joints, heart, kidney and mediastinum. So which are the different predisposing factors? So diabetes mellitus already, it is an independent factor both for the COVID-19 patient and also for the mucormycosis. So diabetes mellitus is the single most important risk factor in 80% of the cases of the mucormycosis in India. Now what is the primary reason which facilitates the mucoral spores to germinate in COVID-19 patient? So the first and most important is a low oxygen level, so hypoxia. So that favors the growth of the fungi and multiplication of the fungi occurs. The high glucose level, particularly in diabetes patient, new onset hyperglycemia patient or steroid induced hyperglycemia. In acidic medium we know that fungi they grow very well. So metabolic ketoacidosis and metabolic acidosis and diabetic ketoacidosis. So these are the conditions where these fungal spores they grow well. High iron levels, they increase ferritin level, that favors the growth of the fungal spores. Decreased phagocytic activity of WBC due to immunosuppression, that may be mediated by the virus, coronavirus, or it may be mediated by the steroid, or it may be due to other comorbidities. Apart from that, other factors are the prolonged hospitalization. It may be involved with the mechanical ventilation or it may be without the mechanical ventilators. So apart from that, other predisposing factors which are responsible for mucormycosis are already told by Dr. Santosh sir. Now come to the laboratory diagnosis of mucormycosis. Now which precautions should be taken while diagnosing these mucormycosis cases in laboratory? So no special precautions other than general laboratory precautions are required in the laboratory. Direct examination of the clinical sample, culture of the sample, fungal culture and histopathology is confirmatory. Always you have to keep in mind that there are chances of mixed infection. So always look for another fungus or any other opportunistic fungus if one species you are able to found. Which are the different specimens which are collected from the patient? It depends on the clinical picture. So if the patient is having nasal symptoms, so nasal scraping from meatus, nasal thrust, nasal discharge, aspirate from the sinuses when there are rhinocerebral lesions. After surgery, the tissues which are removed from the sinuses that can be sent for the culture. If there is involvement of the palate, so palatal mucosal tissue can be sent to the laboratory. Skin scraping if there is involvement of the skin. Bronchoalveolar lavage if there is involvement of the lungs. And in gastrointestinal and disseminated cases, there is need to send the tissue biopsy from the involved sites. And this is very debridement material. So repeated debridement is needed. So that debridement material should be sent to the laboratory because repeated isolation of the fungus is the key. Now specimen collection and transport. We know the specimens which are collected. So these specimens should be collected properly from the affected part in a sterile container or in a sterile culture tube to avoid the contamination of the sample. And it should be transported to the laboratory as early as possible. So in the laboratory, a very important test we do, that is the KOH bed mount. So that can be done for all samples for fungal elements. So what we are able to see? We are able to see the fungal elements. So these are the fungal elements. We are able to see the hyphae, non-septate irregular ribbon-like hyphae. This is the high power feature of the hyphae with wide angle bifurcation, and we can go for the past staining and Gomorrhe's Withenaway silver staining, which highlight the fungal hyphae. So how the report is given? So many times we give the report like the fungal element C. So fungal element, they are suggestive of the filamentous fungi, like the mucorales. Mucorales means all the rhizopus mucor like that. Then it may also include the opportunistic fungi like the aspergillus and penicillium. Because by KOH mount, we cannot differentiate which is the fungus. We only can give the provisional report. Budding is cells and pseudo-hyphae which are suggestive of the candida. Sometimes there may be mixed infection, we can see fungal elements along with the candida. Fungal element not seen. If the report is like this, it doesn't mean that there is no fungal infection. So it cannot rule the fungal infection. In tissues, we are able to see only hyphae, and in culture we are able to see the aerial growth. So sporangium, hyphae, both we can see in the culture. So that's why culture is a definitive diagnosis for the mucormycosis. So which culture media we are using? Saccharose dextrose then potato dextrose agar. These media are used, inoculated with the sample, and it is inoculated at room temperature and at 37 degrees centigrade up to 4 weeks. Yes, we have to wait for 4 weeks. So that is a longer time. But the mucorals which are responsible for mucormycosis, they grow rapidly within 3 to 7 days. There may be white, fluffy, grey or brown growth, but it is difficult to identify the genera based on the colony morphology, and that's why we need to go for the lactophenol cotton blue culture, lactophenol cotton blue preparation. So by LCB we can identify the fungus. So rhizopus is most commonly isolated fungus in 50 to 60% of the mucormycosis cases. This is the fungus. It is identified by its rhizoids which are present at this base, sporangium. The picture is very clear in LPCB of culture. This is another fungus mucor which is isolated commonly in mucormycosis. Here there is absence of the rhizoids. Now this is the LPCB picture of the mucor, broad septate hyphae with extension of columella in the sporangium, and there is absence of the rhizoids. Third common species is the Absidia. Mature blue stained sporangiums are there and broad septate hyphae are there. So it is coming under the Cunninghamiella family. Apart from this single type of infection, we have to keep in mind the mixed infection. Mixed infection is possible because the patient is already immunocompromised patient. So there are chances of opportunistic fungal infection. So that is Aspergillus, Candida, Penicillium. So these infections may occur in the same patient. We have isolated such patients, these fungi in patients. After 4 weeks, if there is no growth on these media, then we can say that the sample is negative for the fungus. But there is no need to wait for 4 weeks because mucorals they grow within 3 to 7 days. So if there is no growth after 7 days, repeat the sample if there is high suspicion. So what are the limitations of the fungal culture? So already I have told you that you have to wait for 4 weeks to say that the sample is negative for the fungal culture. Fungi, they are actually difficult to isolate because isolation of the fungi depends on the proper sample collection. Exudate and necrotic tissue which contain few viable organisms, that tissue need heavy inoculum, so large samples there that is needed. Isolation of the fungus correlate with the clinical condition and immunocompromised state of the patient. Repeated samples they are needed for confirmation. So if surgical debridement you are doing, so every time the sample should be sent so that we can confirm the diagnosis of the patient. So other methods of diagnosis are serological methods like the ELISA, immunoblot technique, then immunodiffusion, but they are having variable success rates. Then molecular assays like PCR, restriction fragment length polymorphism, and DNA sequencing, they are most reliable methods. And nowadays new method of diagnosis is there, Malvitov. Here we can do rapid identification of the fungus up to the species level. But for treatment purpose, the diagnosis up to species level is not needed because most of the fungi they are sensitive to amphotericin B and posaconazole. So in last 2-3 weeks we have some samples.
Good afternoon. Today I will be dealing with the histopathology in cases of mucormycosis. Now, Dr. Sadhana has elaborately described the size of specimen and how to transport it. I will be restricting myself only for the histopathological biopsy specimens. Now, for the histopathology, any tissue which is biopsied, it can be from the nasal polyp or debridement done from the sinuses or nasal cavity. Any biopsy which is removed from the body should be sent for the histopathological evaluation, should be sent in the 10% formalin. Now, if you drain any abscess, please make sure that the part of abscess wall should be sent along with the rest of the biopsy material. One most important thing is please send each and every bit you debride, because not every bit will include the fungal elements. There is a difference or the difference in the involvement of different tissues. Most of the tissues which are necrotic will have high fungal elements, whereas polyps will have most of inflammatory component and lesser fungal elements. So please send each and every bit, and every time you debride the specimen, send it to the lab till we get the diagnosis. Now, a little bit about the pathophysiology. It has been elaborately described by Dr. Sadhana. The rapid growth usually happens in the setting of neutropenia and the diabetic ketoacidosis, because acidity increases the iron along with the high glucose level, promotes the growth of fungal elements. The most important for the pathological changes is angioinvasion. Angioinvasion is common in the mucormycosis. It invades both veins as well as arteries. They cause the thrombus formation and results in the tissue necrosis. The most important is whatever is necrosed dead tissue, it forms nidus for the additional fungal growth. Now, for the histopathological diagnosis, we use these 4 stains. Hematoxin and eosin is the routine stain we use for reporting all histopathological biopsies. Another 2, pyridic acid strip and gomeroids methenamine silver with PAS and GMS. These are the special stains only for the diagnosis of fungal elements. The Gill-Nielsen stains will be done in some of the biopsies if we get granulomatous response to in the biopsies. Now, this is the routine H&E stain we do for all biopsies. If you look at this, these are the fungal hyphae I described by Dr. Sadhana. These are pure fungi, percepted as 90-degree or wide angle branching. Sometimes we get these round structures. These are the hyperstructures which are cut perpendicular to its long axis. Many times these forms are difficult to identify. There we require special stains. It's another photomicrograph which shows a granulomatous reaction. This is a epithelioid granuloma with Langan type of giant cell. Now look at this. Here there are few fungal elements. So we can have granulomatous response. It is the host response to the mucoid infection. It is all these 3 slides are H&E only, routine. Now look at this. This is the vessel. The vessel is totally occluded by the fungal thrombus, which is causing hemorrhages. This is again one of the vessel totally occluded by a thrombus, and there are fungal elements. You can see here fungal elements, a little bluish. And what we get is a ischemic necrosis in the surrounding tissue. So when we get this type of picture in histology, we look for fungus inside the vessel. Okay. Nowadays, in this COVID period, we are looking at the fungi at a different size, which we have never seen. For example, these are the nerve fibers, 1, 2, and these are the nerve fibers. We can see the fungal elements. This is the larger view. These are the fungal elements in the perineurium space as well as inside the nerves, which we have never seen in the nerves. Now this is a necrotic bony piece. Here there are fungi. Here you can appreciate the fungal hyphae. Now even the necrotic bone is invaded by the fungal hyphae. So when we are not, we can't easily recognize or identify a fungus, we sometimes resort to special stains like GMS and PARS, where in GMS stain, it stains a part of polysaccharide in the fungal wall, so that they stand out as blackish elements on the background of green-blue. Easy to understand. This is PARS stain. Here also it stains the mucopolysaccharide. One of the moieties, glycol moiety of a mucopolysaccharide, they stand out more pinkish on the background of a light color. Not all cases of mucormycosis will require special stains, but as a rule, for the early diagnosis, we do not want to spare one day for the diagnosis, so we will do all 3 stains, routine HNE as well as special stain in a single setting, and we will get report on the 3rd day. Now this is another picture. This is sporangiospore. I have never seen this in my 24 hours of pathology practice. Even my teachers, who have spent 40 years in pathology and in autopsy pathology, they have never seen this. Even they are specialized in parasitology, specifically in histopathology, they have never seen these type of structures. Now these are the fungal, mucor fungal hyphae, easy to recognize for pathologists, but these melanin-like pigment containing sporangiospores typically happens in this COVID area. So everybody is surprised why we should get this. These are the spores produced asexually by the mucor. Now it is not only enough to diagnose mucor positively. We have to separate or differentiate it from the other fungal elements which are invasive. For example, Aspergillus, we can easily differentiate by routine HNE and the special stains. We do not require specialized study for this, but these are recognized as narrow, long fungal hyphae which are septate, whereas mucor is septate or a posiseptate. And here you have a branching which is acute angle, that is 45 degree, whereas in mucor you have a wide 90 degree branching. In Candida, you get yeast forms, hyphae as well as pseudohyphae, which is very easy to differentiate by routine sections. Now what type of report you will get? In the report, you will get first about the fungal load and whether it is a mild fungal load or a heavy fungal load or moderate infection. Another is the morphology of fungus consistent with mucorally species. The third thing you will get is the composition of inflammatory infiltrate, that is a host response, whether it is suppurative inflammation only in neutrophils or whether it is a granulomatous response. Every patient which shows a granulomatous response will be subjected for Jaden stain. So you will receive a report one day later on, but diagnosis of mucormycosis you will get on the same day or the 3rd day. The degree of tissue necrosis, whatever specimen we receive, what percentage of tissue is necrosed, that will be also documented in the report. And the last thing is tissue invasion, whether the mucosa, submucosa, vessel, nerve or bone, anything which is invaded will be documented inside the report. Now 3 elements are important: the morphology, the host response, whether it is suppurative or granulomatous, and third thing is tissue invasion will be definitely reported in the report. About the turnaround time, it is 3 working days for routine reporting, which includes HNE as well as special stains. If there is a granulomatous inflammation, there will be 1 more day because we want to do Jaden stain. But even on the second, suppose we get the granulomatous reaction, on the same day you will get the report that the fungal elements are seen, but final report on additional mycobacterial infection you will receive a day later. These are the references.
Thank you, speakers. Hope you all benefited from this academic session. Looking at the brighter side of this COVID-19 pandemic, one of the things that it has taught us is that we need to work as a team. We may belong to different specialities, but today we stand together, joined in a common purpose to combat this black fungus. We cannot change the direction of the wind. We cannot change the direction of this pandemic or the mucormycosis outbreak. But we are fortunate to have a team of expert faculty members led by our Executive Director, Dr. Suchitra Nagre Madam, who is guiding us to adjust our sails to tackle this particular situation. I request Dr. Suchitra Madam to please address us.
Thank you, Janice. I'll not take much of your time. I just remember that we used to sit in our lectures when I was doing my UG for 1 hour, and then we used to look at the clock that when it is going to get over. So, thank you to the Department of Clinical Research and Incubation Center for organizing such a wonderful lecture. Last week we had a meeting of all these concerned departments about management of mucor at Mymar Medical College. And after seeing all today's presentation, I am very much sure that all the departments which will be involved or which are involved in this management of mucor are completely ready to guide the team of Mymar when we will be having more cases. Already we had few cases registered with Mymar, but unfortunately I think we lost that patient. And just for the information of all, that registration of the patient when it is getting confirmed is mandatory with the government authorities, and then the amphotericin supply is under the control of government as per the guidelines, similar to the remdesivir supply or tocilizumab supply. Actually, when I have seen all the presentation, I was just wondering when Zope sir said that they are seeing few things which they or their teachers have never ever seen in the medical management of any patient or any case in their lifetimes. So this is really alarming situation, I feel, and we have to be very cautious. And then again it comes down to the judicious use of treatment with the updated knowledge, which is must. And on this occasion, I would like to really thank the entire team of Mymar Medical College who managed COVID very well. And because of this service which we could offer to the people of Mawad and the surrounded areas, as few days back I already declared once, but I think there are new PG students and interns sitting here and new staff is there. I would just like to share two things, that one company which is German based, which is having their company premises in Takwe, they donated us 2 Drager ventilators because we could serve in the COVID times for the people of Mawad and surrounded area. Yesterday we have also received oxygen production plant which will be installed in Mymar Medical College in coming 15 days, which was given by some NGO, and it is worth rupees 60 lakh. And yeah, so I think these are one of the good achievements in recent past of Mymar activity, because जेव्हा मायमरमध्ये कोविडचं काम करण्याची वेळ आली तर मला एवढं आठवतं की आपणही सगळे खूप घाबरलेले होतो आणि वी वर नॉट हॅव्हिंग की कुठल्या दिशेने हे सगळं जाणार आहे. इट वॉज मार्च 2020, पण थँकफुली विथ द हेल्प ऑफ एव्हरीवन हू इज वर्किंग विथ द टीम मायमर, starting from the doctors to the nurses to the mama maushi, security, ambulance drivers, and mainly the PG residents of my college, we could really achieve a good we could give the good service. I'll say, I'll not say we have achieved something really, because there is nothing to achieve in COVID times, I feel, and every other time we are getting something new. We were just wondering that when it is a COVID time and when we are having patients who are getting so pure oxygen, how can they develop mucor? Was our question. And with the team of Department of ENT, we have already started, which was suggested in few of these presentations, like screening the patients who are staying for longer in ICU. So Department of ENT had already screened the patient who are having maximum stays and comorbidity in our ICU of Mymar Medical College, and we'll continue this practice, and I'm very sure with the help of you all we'll definitely pass through these difficult times. Once again, thank you team Department of Clinical Research, and thank you all speakers for giving such a wonderful insight about mucor. Thank you.
I thank our respected Dr. Suchitra Nagre Madam for being the constant driving force behind all the academic, non-academic, for all the endeavors that we all take, and successfully leading us, guiding us in these difficult times. I thank Colonel R.P. Gupta sir, respected Dr. Belsare Madam, all senior heads of department, senior faculty members from MIMER as well as College of Physiotherapy for attending this session. I wholeheartedly thank all the speakers for giving such, for covering such a complex topic in such simple words in a manner that all of us could understand and come to know about the intensity of this problem. I thank the support staff, particularly Ashwini Madam, who has always been very instrumental in all these activities. I'm sorry we could not take a lot of questions because of the paucity of time, but I'm sure we can continue the discussion during tea.